Welcome to COVID-19 Insights Podcast. How do we survive and thrive in the decade of action? By ASEAN Center for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue, or ACS-DSD, which is hosted at the College of Management, Mahidol University.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to listen to our session. This is titled Confronting Unavoidable Issues. 2020 has sped up the need to think through key issues regarding sustainability, and a big part of that now is the pandemic that we've been facing. My name is Randall, and I work at the College of Management, Mahidol University, and with me today is Dave McCon, and we're going to be sharing some interesting points of discussion, I think. So thanks for joining me today, Dave.
Thanks for inviting me, Randall. It's always interesting to have these discussions with you.
I've known Dave for several years, introduced to me by a colleague in Japan, and I know that he's worked in consumer insights, but maybe it'd be better if you could introduce your own self a bit, please.
Sure, thanks, Randall. Dave McCocken. I am an Australian, originally lived in Asia for about 25 years. Most of that time I've worked in the advertising industry as the head of strategy for Asia Pacific for big global ad agencies. Now what I do is I consult companies on their brand storytelling and how they've got to adapt their brands to the current consumer and people and media conditions. And that therefore gets me involved in doing a lot of market research, a lot of consumer understanding, and then putting that all together in storytelling. As you said, 2020 is an interesting year because depressing as it has been for a lot of things, it's also a year in which a lot of longer term issues have sped up, trends, etc. And I guess we're going to get into some of those and how they affect sustainability. So they're going to every time just reuse, chuck out plastic bags and I think this is a bigger thing about how, because of one crisis about, COVID, other crises took a step back,
right,
and almost reverted back to where they were.
Yeah, it's like our we're making one step forward and then take two steps back when our priorities shift. I remember last year we met up at the event about sustainability hosted by the Thailand Market Research Society. One of the really interesting speakers was talking about pollution and e-waste and the plastic waste in the oceans. And this has been in the news so much, especially that we generate quite a bit ourselves in Thailand. And I was just looking at a figure from last year. They said Thailand generates about 7,000 tons of styrofoam and plastic waste every day, about 80% of which is plastic. And so we keep on hearing about this, and you would think awareness is really high. We have a lot of problems with burning trash and not recycling properly, and it's getting into our food chain, it's getting into the fish, it's getting into the birds, and that means when we eat, it's getting into us. Yeah. And it's just like a really loud cry that we need to change our behaviors. And I'm a consumer behavior person, I think you are as well. It's not an easy thing to do. And I remember when we had the panel discussion, somebody in the audience asked me, well, have you changed your behavior? And I said, as a matter of fact, I have. I've always been raised to be careful about turning off the lights if I'm not in the room and not having the TV running if nobody's watching it. But I really stopped using the single-use plastic water bottles as much as I could, and I started to use cups that I could wash and refill. And I just think it has to start somewhere, and we can all make small changes as individuals and hope that this will add up on a larger scale. But basically, as luck would have it, we were asked if we could put together some commentaries and create some podcasts about sustainability in ASEAN. And I remember we had a really interesting conversation where you talked about the dairy and how much energy it takes to clean the bottles, the glass bottles. And I remember once upon a time we had the dairy people delivering the glass bottles of milk, and then they would pick them up again. And it's kind of recyclable, it's kind of sustainable, and yet it was a really high energy cost, a really high water cost. And then plastic comes along, and you think, yay, problem solved, and yet no, new problems arise.
Right. I think that's one of the issues. Is like one problem seems to always lead to what seems like a solution, and then we shift back again and we realize it's created another one. And sometimes it's like replacement, it's the replacement psychology of, okay, to cope with this issue, we're going to revert to this one. And so we've seen the massive increase in the use of plastics because of COVID in terms of food delivery. I mean, I just noticed that last year, like you say, I tried to actively use, one of the actively things I did was I basically managed to go a whole year without using straws, not just plastic straws. I just gave up using straws of all types. I also refused to drink coffee out of cups with lids on it, right? Now that sounds great, except that as COVID comes into play and we start getting food delivered and things, whether I'd asked for it or not, there's always straws in the bag, right? So we end up at home with this massive collection of plastic straws that I don't want to use. Well, what happens? But then you see other things coming into play. So, and I'll give you a simple thing that happened. A few weeks into the shutdown that we saw in a whole bunch of countries around COVID, I was actually going to do a webinar with some people in Bangladesh. And one of the guests that I had on this webinar sent me a graphic that they'd found where somebody had illustrated the point that with all of the consciousness we have about washing our hands more properly, doing the 20-second wash, washing our hands more frequently, washing down, cleaning up, washing down, cleaning up, that actually if everybody in the country just followed the rules that people are asking about washing your hands properly, that it increases the water usage by about 15%.
Jeez.
Now, in Bangladesh, for example, the graphic that guy sent me was Bangladesh already, unbelievably, you know, because it's a country that has lots of monsoons and all that sort of stuff and flooding, but it suffers from water shortage. And at the same time, then you're having this stay at home, but wash your hands more, and it suddenly turns out that could involve up to 15% more water being used by every person in the country. So the water shortage becomes chronic. Now, that got me interested because the last couple of years I've been looking at some issues about water shortages. I mean, the realization came to me a year or so ago when Chennai in India, a city of about 10 million people, basically ran out of water. And to a Westerner, I guess, or to somebody that lives in, you know, somebody like Bangkok or Singapore, the concept of like running out of water, what does that mean? But literally we've seen Cape Town a few years ago, Chennai in India. But it turns out there are many, many cities around the world that are living on a knife's edge in terms of being able to supply clean drinking and washing water to their population, not because they don't have the mechanics, but simply because there's not enough water. And we've heard all this for, I think, probably decades, Randall, about, you know, we'll eventually have water wars and things like that. Well, the truth is this is all coming now to the fore. And I think what as happens when you have a chronic problem like COVID, it reverses and delays some other issues, but it also brings to life some issues. And so that one point got us thinking about the water footprints of the world and what does that really mean. And I think it's really a value that companies and organizations start to take on board, that their water usage is going to become more and more a significant factor in the way in which they have to think about their business practice, but also about marketing, because it will be picked up a lot more simply because it's in short supply.
I think, this is really one of our points, is that we need to raise awareness because, as you said, decades ago, I was hearing stories that Australia said the increased population means there's more demand for food, and yet there are water shortages, which makes it more difficult to farm. And just last week in the news, they said Pattaya was, at a critical point of a water shortage.
Yeah.
And you're like, saying what?
Yeah.
We're on the rainy season. But it's counterintuitive sometimes. Just having water doesn't mean it's usable water.
Right.
It takes energy to produce water, and it takes water to produce energy.
You raise a really good point. But we forget that tropical climate places, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, southern India, etc., are as prone to have chronic water problems. And that's what's coming to the fore now. It's not It's not those. I mean, if you said Australia, because Australia, sort of historically we see as this giant dry continent. Okay, we get that. Yes, Sydney has massive water problems. Perth has chronic water shortages problems. But it's even places here in the tropics that, yes, we have monsoons and wet seasons, but the truth is that there's just not enough water. It's just not there. So we have to rethink how we're doing things.
And it's really becoming a kind of holistic crusade. It's not about saying we need to recycle or we need to have a better waste management. For whatever reasons, we're facing global warming, and global warming affects the crops, and it affects the glaciers, and these affect the water supply. And now this pandemic, as you just said, we're using more water to try to clean, and we're using more plastic to try to stay hygienic. I just read a publication that came out in the Journal of Nature, and they said that the UN created these Sustainable Development Goals, and they set these goals in 2015, largely to be achieved by 2025, 2030, and they said it's impossible. They're going to have to revise these goals because, basically things stopped.
Right.
And also we stepped backwards in some ways, like the plastic use. But, it's just, I think what you raised was, wow, water is just something we don't think about, and yet it's so incredibly important. We use it for everything, even looking for oil, drilling for oil and producing anything, an assembly line is spraying water all the time, and cleaning anything uses water. And of course, farming uses water, and creating plastic uses water.
It's even the conflict sometimes that when you hear things like, last year I was doing a presentation for a global cosmetics company. And one of the things I discovered was that one of their, as far as I can tell, very good moisturizing skin creams, very high quality product, etc. And it's a moisturizer. It's about keeping your skin moist.
Yeah.
The problem is it literally takes 100 litres of water to make a very small,
like 30 milliliters.
30 milliliters of this stuff, right?
Oh my goodness.
So you've got to balance out. So to keep your personal cheeks moist, there's 100 litres of water going to waste, right? How can we maintain that sort of thing? And I know you were digging out a lot of really interesting examples of how much water it takes to make things, right?
Right. I never thought about this, and it again is counterintuitive. So it's like, okay, well, I want to drink some water. So how much water does it take to produce water? You're like, is that a trick question? Is that like a 1 + 1 =? Yeah, but they said in the facts I looked up, they said it takes about 1.4 liters to produce 1 liter of water. But then if you factor in the bottle and the label, that's another 3 liters or so.
Yeah.
So you're looking at almost 5 liters
so it's
per
5
liter.
litres. You just think about that multiplied out on what you consume of these things every day, right?
Right. And so what I ran across is, people talk about the carbon footprint, but now maybe we should be talking about the water footprint. Yeah, and we could look at the water footprint for manufacturing a product, which realistically should be holistic. So if you say, well, it only took 1.4 liters to make that, you say, but don't forget about the bottle.
Yeah.
You say, well, it takes about 1.5, somewhere in between liters to make 500 cc's of Coke. You say, well, what about the water to grow the sugar beets? And we need to factor these in as a big picture. So if companies do, and maybe they should, start talking about their water footprint, it needs to be a more holistic view.
I think that concept of the water footprint, which is something that I've just noticed in the last, maybe it's just me and you, but I hadn't really paid much attention, hadn't seen much about that until maybe about a year ago. And it's really started to come home to me that, companies are going to have to start thinking about this. It's not just the water in the actual immediate production. How much water is needed to get that bottle of water from the factory to
logistics,
to the table in front of me where I've got it sitting in front of me right now, the logistics. How much as it goes into the growing of whatever goes into that bottle, where the plastics comes from, the manufacturing of all those processes. This footprint idea is, I think, one of the things that's going to, as you said, carbon footprints, we've sort of got used to. We don't maybe put enough thought into it, most of us. But water footprints is going to, I think, be the next big thing.
Yeah. And I mean, at least become aware of it, right? That's always the starting point when we talk about, marketing a product and if we want to change consumer behavior. So it's like, if you just turn on a light and leave it on all night, that consumes water as well.
Yeah.
They said it takes about 95 liters of water to produce 1 kilowatt of electricity. So a 60-watt light bulb for 12 hours takes about 60 liters of water. And then, we're moving towards electric vehicles, EVs, and you're like, batteries, and those are so great. And you go, well, what about the e-waste? And you say, well, also don't forget about the water consumption.
Right,
so something like a solar panel.
Yeah.
You said you'd heard it could, be almost 2,000 liters?
2,000 liters.
To make a solar panel?
Yeah.
Whoa. Wow. So, it's not free, it's not magic. It doesn't just come out of the air or the ether.
Right.
I looked up some of these. A banana requires about 160 liters of water. An apple about 125 liters. A cup of coffee about 130 liters to produce 1 cup, 125 milliliters.
Yeah.
And almost 19,000 liters to produce 1 kilo of roasted coffee.
So for
That's
those people,
crazy.
and I can imagine, because I listen to
drink coffee
podcasts
every
all the
day.
time,
Oh.
and it's not, my normal practice is that I sit down most mornings with a cup of coffee and listen to podcasts. So there's probably a bunch of people listening to this now, and just have a think about that. Your cup of coffee was 130 litres of water. Now, if you multiply that by how many people today are drinking coffee around the world, and just go look up, I haven't got it in front of me, look up the number of cups of Starbucks that are sold in a day, or the number of Nescafe, right? These are amazing things. And so we know, for example, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years in various countries about the fact that using non-native crops or trying to go to certain cash crops, these sorts of things are big things that will start to play out in the public space more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. Just water just seems like it's always out there. It's not it's not gold. It's not a precious resource, but it's renewable, but it's not unlimited, and it does have costs. So it's a kind of chicken and egg in a way, because obtaining water takes energy, and producing energy also takes water.
Right.
And we need to start to realize the ratios of some of these things.
Right.
Is it worth it to consume a pair of cotton pants when that requires 8,000 liters,
Right.
versus whatever alternatives we have? But again, to give more thought to this, people can look up the water footprint. There is the Water Footprint Network, who have some calculators online, and these topics maybe on the surface seem independent, but they're really interwoven in terms of sustainable consumption, waste, conservation of energy, conservation of water, electricity, just being careful not to overuse, and hopefully become aware, if not enlightened, before we reach the point of no return.
Well, that's where I suspect what's going to happen is, if you look at a lot of industries, so we saw this to a certain extent with plastics and the fact that certain cities, I just noticed that in the last week or so that Tokyo has now banned plastic bags at retail totally, right? So a lot of big cities are starting to do that. And yes, the COVID thing may have reversed it for a little while, but there's an ongoing trend to sort of remove plastic bags. But then that creates a lot of other issues. But you see it within industries. The coffee industry over the last 10 years has moved a lot to sort of track and trace apps, so that you can find out which hill of which farm in Nicaragua those coffee beans were grown, and how much the farmer got paid, right, by fair trade policies, right? Not universal, not used by everybody. The way in which people measure and talk about this varies by company, etc. But there is a slowly building awareness. But, that was like what I call a peak interest category. Coffee was an easy one to focus on, an easy one to get publicity around. And it was sort of like, the developed world's guilty pleasure at the expense of poor people in underdeveloped countries, right? Yeah. But what's going to happen is, and I find it really interesting, the COVID situation has led to many, as I said right at the beginning, one of the things it's done is sped things up. And one of the things that's sped up is people downloading apps onto their phone to track things. Now, whether that was government implemented track and trace procedures like we've seen in Singapore, where it's compulsory, or voluntary in other marketplaces, Whether it's like the apps that all of us in Thailand have to have now, because we have to have an app so that we can do a QR code to get entry to shopping malls, etc.
Yeah.
But what's happening now is people getting more and more used to downloading apps to track things. And what we're going to start seeing is more companies having to have apps that track and show you what's going into their products. And particularly, I think this is going to be water related and individual water usage. How are we going to measure what our water usage is? How are we going to be accountable for that in certain ways?
Yeah, maybe they could apply something like gamification, where people, reduce their consumption over time and they can earn points.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I mean, most of us that pay water rates, or pay for water in our houses or apartments, are sort of aware of, summer we use more water than winter,
Right.
or whatever. But it's not just that. It's the water we use outside that we have no real comprehension of how much water we actually use. And so I think what will happen is there'll be more and more aware, and it'll of course, the great majority of the population, no offense to anybody, probably don't care.
Right.
Probably won't care for a long while. But there'll be more and more interest that will force more and more companies to provide more and more information.
And I mean, end of the day, it's not happening on its own. We are a huge part of the problem, and that's why we need to wake up and realize that every little bit helps. And so that's part of our effort here. Sure, we can say governments and we can say companies can do their part and they can make a bigger change, but we're all involved in this. We're all consumers. We're all using water. We're all using electricity. We're all consuming and generating waste. So every little bit helps, and we need to be mindful and teach our children and the next generations to be cautious, to be mindful, to think about sustainability.
Certainly. We've joked about, we haven't joked. There has been a discussion for a long while about, the 21st century will be the century in which we get into water wars. Well, reality, I don't think it's such a joke. I don't think it's such a joke. And when you have chronic big cities like Chennai, and lots of others. I read a statistic that at any one time there are 30 plus cities in the world, of cities of 5 million or more people, that are in chronic water shortage. And that's only going to get worse.
Yeah.
And so eventually this is going to become major government issues and major policy issues. But for companies and sustainability enterprises or enterprises interested in it, it's something that should be at the front end of their thinking right now.
So maybe in the not so distant future, we'll see some labeling with water footprints.
I'm sure we will. I'm sure we're going to start seeing QR codes or some other thing on packaging that'll take you to the water footprint.
Yeah.
And so you can track where it's going and what's being used.
And of course, not to overlook human rights and child labor and the chocolate farming and things like that.
All
of them.
It's complex, man. It's really complex.
Yeah. I have to admit, it gets a little bit depressing, but on the other hand, we're trying to make a difference, trying to work towards change.
Well, that's all you can do, is hope that you can start making little steps towards change. This is where probably, as you said, with those UN goals, we've missed the boat on achieving them as we wanted to. You've just got to try and make them achievable. It's like a stretch achievable, right?
But at least a positive movement, not a negative.
Keep on moving, and maybe keep on having these discussions and keep on getting more, trying to raise awareness of different issues. So.
Well, I hope that gives everyone some food for thought. It was certainly an interesting and new area for me, which David raised my awareness. I'd never thought about how much water it takes to produce things, and now I'm not an expert, but I certainly know enough to have an interesting conversation, and I'm certainly going to be more mindful of my consumption, which is the starting point.
Yeah, let's hope so. And so I hope everybody that listens to this just has a little bit of think of that. But there are so many other areas, of course. Water's just one part of it, and we just got to keep on thinking about the whole mix of it and how they integrate. So.
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Dave, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you very much, Randall, for inviting me.
All right. Hope it was useful for people.
Okay.
Be well.
Thank you.